So hi there, welcome to Mad Sense. In this video, I want to answer some of the what the bleep questions about what we mean about the phenomenology or the special effects associated with how this phenomenon presents information to the brain. And I use the word brain there specifically because actually this is an intrusive effect where this phenomenon is introducing information that the brain recognizes. And the fact that the brain recognizes it means that it's provoking the brain, which provokes the mind. So that's how we need to be thinking about it. So what I want to do is kind of cover some descriptive work. And this is because the description hearing voices is a fairly narrow description of the facets of the special effects. It's the piece that we end up focusing on. People will say, well, what do your voices say? And actually there's much more going on under the hood in terms of how this phenomenon is catching our attention and inserting information into our perception. So I'm going to talk about the sort of modes, if you like, of intrusion. So descriptions of the mechanism by which new information is inserted by this phenomenon into the brain and mind. And I say we usually describe them in terms of sensory language. So what I'll do, as I've mentioned beforehand, there's a lot of body language. So I'll cover a slightly more, perhaps, entertaining version of the body language in the sense of sort of showing you how all these kind of sensory dimensions, can be combined by this phenomenon to create a scenario that creates a story, which is typically the actual experience of it. And then I'll summarize the significance of this in terms of the impact on the mind and on our life. So the how this phenomenon actually inserts information into the brain is in the detail. So when we're saying hearing voices, we're not actually giving you a very good description of what this thing is that is actually inserting this information that provokes the mind to ask all these what the bleep questions that become the experience of it. And this is the point. The information is being inserted. It kickstarts the processor of the mind, and the mind at the very least begins to process it. I mean, I've learned to interrupt that as soon as possible, and that's part of my recovery model. And of course, this video will show you why it's important to do that. So first, I'm going to talk about auditory and auditory verbal experiences of this phenomenon. So auditory is just sound. Auditory verbal is sound in the form of language. And of course, what I'm going to do is focus on the sort of progressive steps of how this phenomenology is presented and changed. So I've experienced all four of the ones I'm going to talk about here. And then I'll show you the fourth one is the one that is the most common experience that certainly from what, as I've discovered from actually speaking to people at Hearing Voices support groups. The fourth one is the most common. It's definitely not the only one. And then we'll go on to describe the other kind of formats afterwards. But I say these are the most common, particularly the fourth one that I'm going to talk about. So the first is just auditory. So this means it's simply sound presented in an unusual way. The unusual way is simply that I hear it and you don't. So therefore, it has no context. That's what's unusual about it. And the fact that it's unusual, is the thing that raises the eyebrows and provokes the sort of what the bleep questions. Because I hear it and you don't hear it, that's the context. It provokes my mind into thinking, well, why am I hearing it and you're not hearing it? Something's going on. So, so what is it that we're hearing in that sort of context? It's a whole range of sounds. So for me, for example, the minimum that I have is sort of akin to tinnitus. It is a sort of not so much a ringing in the ears as the sort of sort of buzzing, tingling sound. It's I suppose, almost a softer tempo than tinnitus, for example. So for me, I've experienced what I would call tinnitus after being in a loud club, for example, and I come out of that and my ears are ringing. This is a little different. It has a sort of tinkly quality to it for me, and I'm representing that by this icon, just simply a sound, that has a sort of tonality to it, a tempo to it, sort of, as you know, I mean, all sounds have some sort of qualities to it. It can be literally anything and everything in terms of sound. So, the sound of drums, the sound of someone knocking on the door, the sound of music, not as in Julie Andrews, but literally music. A whole range of sounds, clicks, bumps, thuds, any kind of sound, that is sort of out of context. Some of them very simple, so thuds, as I say, and bumps, that are enough to get your attention. As I say, raise your eyebrows, make you look, and at least ask the question, what was that? So this kind of stuff, many people experience. So when we talk about sort of hearing voices, we are usually talking about people who experience something a little more intrusive than this. Although some of these can, of course, be very intrusive. So severe tinnitus is, in fact, incredibly distracting. If you're hearing music, that's that's obviously very intrusive. I met a woman at a support group, a hearing voices support group in New York, who heard voices singing to her, singing Amazing Grace to her, pretty much every day for 20 years at some point. That's not a pleasant experience. And of course, you ask the what the bleep questions at the beginning. In the end, you sort of give up, you acclimatize, you accommodate in some way this kind of strange phenomenon. But whatever it is, even a sound heard out of context is enough to, as I say, raise the eyebrows, and I'm using that, to represent the idea that it's this little element of surprise that then provokes questions in the mind. And the questions are the experience of it, because even if I'm having a relationship here with my own thoughts about what these sounds might be, or where they're coming from, or what it might mean for what's happening to my brain or to me, these questions become the experience of it. And this is, of course, characteristic of the experience. So let's kick it up a notch. The next level up is when I'm actually now introducing a verbal element to it. So this is now language being introduced. I'm now actually hearing the sounds of people speaking. Okay, that's a good way to think about it. Hearing voices, I say, is not a good term. Voices only come from people. So what we actually hear is the sound of people talking. We have to think of it in that context. So if I can hear, two people talking, for me, this kind of quality, as you've seen in my first episode video, it's slightly distant. And of course, this led me to the interpretation in my first sort of 7 or 8 weeks that it had to be my upstairs neighbors, simply because of the context in which I was hearing them. And that's actually simply what happens is you hear voices speaking. And of course, it again raises the eyebrows. Literally, that's the idea that it's getting your attention, this element of surprise, this difference. And of course, it's out of context. So we're asking these what the bleep questions. So as you've seen in the first episode, this can take on different sort of characteristics that shape how your attention is focused in different ways. So when I heard two voices talking about what I was doing, it brought my attention to my activity. That wasn't a deliberate process. That was that was an ordinary, natural mind process. The topic of conversation was my activity. Clearly, that's what I focused on. And then the interpretation, that I reached was that this had to be my upstairs neighbors, was based on the context. The voices, were talking about what I was doing. Therefore, they had to be able to see what I was doing. Therefore, they had to be on the fire escape, and the only people with access to the fire escape was the upstairs neighbors. So that's the what the bleep cycle. I heard people talking about me. I reached the conclusion it had to be my upstairs neighbors. There was no other logical conclusion. And I say on day one, it was just a little, it piqued my interest for want of another description. They seemed concerned. By day two, that interpretation of it changed. By day three, when it persisted, the interpretation changed again. So that's the cycle of what the bleep questions. And this is the point, that no matter what form this takes, it is provoking, and it gains attention through an element of surprise, and it provokes questions. And then remember that when I've spoken about this, I've said it's not only the content of what voices are saying, it has all these other qualities that I would describe as body language. And here I'm going to represent it by one thing, say, for example, volume. So there may be many qualities to it, but volume would be one. So whether the voices are close or further away, will obviously sort of change your interpretation of it. So again, using my first episode example, when I first heard people talking about what I was doing in my apartment, it was a little distant. So, for me, that, led to the interpretation that they were outside my window. They certainly weren't, this wasn't somebody sitting on my couch, in the same room that I was. It was a little distant. It was somebody probably outside. Well, certainly an interpretation of outside would fit the experience of the volume. Let's put it that way. Okay. Now, of course, volume is just one feature. It could be clarity. It could be even the language that they're speaking. So for me, again, something I hear people speak about every so often is that the voices are indistinct, for example, so a bit of mumbling. And of course, what that does is it brings your attention to it. You strain a little harder to hear what it is that they are saying, because this is an intrusive thing. Okay, it has no context. So remember that. So this is now, as I say, the sound of two or more people talking with some body language characteristics that springs this element of surprise on you by a lack of context or being out of context. It provokes a lot of questions. It leads to interpretations that, of course, then shape how we respond to it. The next step up of intrusive, so this is more intrusive than that, if you like. This hearing a sound is one thing. Hearing people talking requires an explanation. Okay, this you can kind of dismiss more easily than you can dismiss this. Okay, so that's what I mean by it's more intrusive. Okay, it's sort of getting in the way of your life more. So the next step up in intrusiveness is when voices actually are talking to you. Because now this, then the commentary is directed at you. It's relevant to you. The context becomes you as a person. And that's the point, is it now becomes personal. So over here, I might be overhearing something. Over here, I'm hearing, people talking about me, also about what I'm doing, about me, about what I'm about to do, about what I'm planning, about what I'm thinking, all of these kinds of things. So, in the same way, this is now very personal. That becomes the frame of reference. And in the same way, as these two have done, is it provokes a series of what the bleep questions, in terms of me trying to understand what on earth is this about? Why is this happening? Why are people talking about what I'm doing? Who is it? How are they doing it? And that's actually another key point to make. That list of questions: who, why, where, when, how, are pretty much the 5 questions that we're going to ask. And of course, there are variations on them. So there's who and by whom. You can add adjectives and adverbs to these things, but there are only these 5 or 6 questions that we ask. And when you recognize it in that context, I hope you can begin to see that actually, as you saw in the first episode videos, the what the bleep questions we ask seem like there's many, because we're looking at the answers to them. But when you bring it back earlier to the question we're asking to reach that answer, the list of questions we ask is actually relatively short. And that's interesting from the point of view of understanding this experience, of course, as a process. So this has become more intrusive because the voices are now talking to me. It becomes personal. It's directed at me. They're saying something about me, puts the focus on me. Whether it's my activity, my thinking, me as a person, whatever it is, it's a facet of me and my concept of self that now comes into focus. And that's, of course, the flip side of this. So the one frame of reference is, where is this coming from? What is it? The other frame of reference is me. So it's this, outside, inside comparison of frames of reference. And both of them, of course, are provoked by this mode of interaction or communication between the individual and this phenomenon. The next step up is now actually when this communication between this phenomenon and an individual becomes two-way. So, of course, the common term used to express this two-way conversation actually is a thought echo. And when people say to you they hear voices, for the majority of people, this is actually what they mean. The majority of people have a two-way conversation with their voices. And the thing about a two-way conversation is that it's an actual interaction between me and this phenomenon, which establishes a relationship between us. So as you've realized here, we're describing this as a thought echo. So what makes this a two-way conversation is I'm still hearing voices now talking to me as up here. What's changed over here is that my thoughts are now expressed as the second half of that conversation. So my thoughts become half of a conversation, expressed in this same bandwidth, if you like, and I actually hear the sound of my own thoughts. So it's almost like hearing myself speak, except of course I'm not vocalizing it. It's my thoughts that are this conversation. They say expressed or experienced as a sound in this bandwidth, if you like, within which I hear voices or hear this phenomenon, with personalities talking about what it is that I'm doing or who I am, etc. So of course this is much more intrusive, and it's more intrusive because not only is it personal, it now establishes an actual relationship. So it rises to the significance in the mind of a relationship, and for most people that relationship is an abusive one. For me, it's hugely disrespectful just by its very nature. So it's an abusive relationship, no matter what voices are saying, as far as I'm concerned. And I say this is what we call a thought echo, because it's now a two-way conversation. It's an interaction. So the thing with an interaction is that's a transactional ping pong game between the hearer and this phenomenon that actually moves the relationship along, number one. Number two, those transactions wire the brain in very particular ways because they are equivalent to an actual relationship and experience between two sentient entities. And of course, that has a much bigger significance in my life than just my own thinking. So this is how it's established a much higher level of significance in my life. It's become this two-way experience where every thought that I have and every comment that voices make moves our relationship along. Okay, and you grow a history, if you like, with voices. So this is incredibly invasive. Okay, this is a hugely invasive thing. It's meddling. No matter what voices say, every comment they make provokes a reaction and a response in the individual. Okay, so in that sense, it's meddling, and it is meddling at the level of thought. It is redirecting my train of thought. It is inserting topics. It's it's inserted this false significance in my life. They say that for many, in fact for most, takes the form of an abusive relationship. And of course, there are lots of studies about abusive relationships. And of course, what we do, is again, we because this thing won't go away, we start to accommodate it, to appease it, to rationalize it, and of course, all of that causes neuroplastic harm, in some sense or another. So, summarizing that page, auditory is just sounds of all types. Bear in mind that they can still be incredibly intrusive. You have to imagine, hearing something for 20 years. That's intrusive beyond the level, that most people can actually conceive of. The next step up is when it becomes verbal. So we're hearing language, and I'll show you on the next slide the importance of language. And remember that when language is introduced, the voices now have a personality, and of course, that comes with body language, which is say provokes the mind in a different way and kind of sets off another whole bunch of what the bleep questions. The next step up is when it becomes personal. Voices are now talking to me. The context becomes my concept of self, and that's what I think about. And of course, all this information is contaminating my concept of self, which is then being programmed into my mind. And then the next step up is this two-way conversation between myself and this phenomenon, which establishes de facto this equivalence of a relationship in my life. And as you'll see later on, when we talk about content and stories, voices have many, many ways of asserting that relationship as abusive, incredibly invasive, and meddling. Okay, so when language is introduced, into the equation, so when it moves from auditory to auditory verbal, that's just indicating the introduction of language. It's important because language is how we understand things. Language is how we share our experiences. It's how we communicate with each other. It's how a relationship, as I say, moves along. As we say something to each other, our relationship changes, or certainly grows. It's a cumulative experience, meaning that every little piece adds to what came before. That's really what language in particular does. But of course, it starts to shape our understanding of the world. This is the other important piece of it. This can often become, the language alone can often become, create an extreme state. So for me, one of the sort of surprising examples, to say my voices call me Greggy Boy, or they started to do this at some point. And as you will see here, they can kind of say stuff that seems semi-benign, just done it on the TV. They can use it as a threat. But certainly I've experienced, if you like, body language, that goes with it, where voices have made the sound of just the way they say Greggy Boy, extremely sinister. It's like something out of a horror movie. I mean, I struggle to describe how hearing the sound of this phenomenon calling me by a rather cutesy name, Greggy Boy, can scare the living shit out of me, okay? And that has happened. So I'm simply saying the body language can be incredibly sinister. So it's like living with a psychopath in your mind. That's really what this is like when you have this two-way conversation, and voices, as they can use inflammatory language, which exaggerates emotions, and it's so intrusive. And of course, what each phrase is doing is it invokes a new context in some way. So this is a threat, just you wait, Greggy Boy. So of course, I know to kind of the what the bleep question it provokes is, what the bleep am I waiting for example. So you have to recognize and say that our mind processing is predictive, that we have a history with voices, that that actually one phrase invokes a context and associations that accelerate the process of thinking about it, which is the experience of the relationship with voices. So thinking becomes this experience, and of course, this emotional flavor. We have these emotional ups and downs and extremes that go with it that are episodic. So this is how this intrusion of auditory and auditory verbal, which are by far the most common, become experiences in the mind that stimulate our reward signals, engage our processor, wire the brain, and are expressed, as episodes of extreme states or extreme emotions. So another one that's quite common is something that is called thought intrusion. So auditory verbal. The next one would be thought intrusions. Now, some people call this, broadcast thoughts. This actually is an interpretation of the phenomenology. So let me go back to the phenomenology itself, which is the thought intrusion. So for me, I need to contrast this to ordinary thinking because it's noticeably different. And I say this is characteristic of this phenomenon. So for me, my own thinking, or ideas have a context. Even if I can't identify the context immediately at the time, if I think about it, if I pay attention to it and think about it, it usually will be something I've thought about, last week or the week before, or whatever. And all that's happening, when a thought arrives in my mind, I will just say, oh, this thought popped into my head. What's happening is that actually the brain, the auto mind, is just feeding in some idea that it's stored for later, basically. And when I have spare capacity, that thought is actually coming into my mind. So that's what's happening when we say, a thought just popped into my head. So obviously, this one is going to be relatively easy to confuse with that. But I say for me, the key thing about the thoughts that come from our own mind that even at the time seem out of context is if I think about it, I will actually find a context. It will relate to something that I'm doing or have been doing or have been thinking about. And so this is how thought intrusion is, again, very, very different. It's this thought that literally, I say, intrudes, and that's what I'm trying to represent by this arrow pushing it, into the mind. And for me, I literally experience it as this bubble of information floating up into my aware mind, but I'm very aware of the boundary. So it's almost as if, if my window of my aware mind was a nice, neat rectangle, it's almost as if, this thing was sort of pushing in and distorting my own sort of boundary as it sort of protrudes, if you like, into my aware mind and sort of floats up. And of course, what you can learn to do with it is simply to say, I've noticed it. I don't know what to do with it. I'm going to ignore it. And in fact, that is the recommended approach for kind of dealing with these. But the key point is that it's different. It seems to have this boundary. It intrudes in this kind of ordinary frame, which is the aware mind. And that, of course, is completely different to inner speech. So there are two things that this is typically confused with. The one is my own thoughts, which are covered over here. The other is people ask the question, isn't this just our inner speech, in some way? And of course, what's happening with our inner speech is, the marvelous thing about the mind is that we can observe ourselves. We observe objects. So you're hopefully focused on this screen here right now, not that one up there, this one here. So that's the object in your focus. And of course, that object could easily be me, or it could easily be you yourself. So we can easily change the object that we're observing. So for me, inner speech is just one of those changes. It's actually when we choose ourselves as the object of observation. And that's the point, is we're observing ourselves, or we may even be observing our thinking, and of course, that's that idea of sort of inner speech, which is me being, a critic, if you like, or an observer on what I'm doing. In fact, I'm not much of for me, for example, I rather like me. I don't criticize myself much at all. And in fact, if you practice mindfulness, you will learn to not bother to criticize yourself at all. You'll actually, end up patting yourself on the back or enjoying what's around you. Anyway, that's a video for later. Key thing here is what's very different about this thought intrusion is that it intrudes rather than observes. That's the key point to take home with it. It's different. It has this boundary that intrudes in my aware mind. The other piece of confusion about it is our interpretation of it, which is that if I am receiving this piece of information, which clearly doesn't come from me, and you can see this from the interpretation of it, it's an intrusion, and I'm asking the question is, how is this piece of information being broadcast to me? So how am I receiving it? which also leads, of course, to questions about, well, are my thoughts being broadcast? Because if somebody else's thoughts are being broadcast and I'm receiving them, then it's just as likely that my own thoughts are being broadcast and someone else is receiving them in exactly the same way. So this is a common interpretation of a thought intrusion. And we simply, because we're receiving this information in an unusual way, we ask the question, are our own thoughts being broadcast? So thought broadcasting is actually interpretive language of the same phenomenology. And the reason I'm spending all this time on highlighting this difference is that this one is the most easily confused. We could ask ourselves, is it our own thoughts? Is it our inner speech where we're observing ourselves? And of course, this is an interpretive explanation of it rather than a technical description of the intrusion itself. So that's what I want to bring your focus to, is it's this intrusion, is this piece of information arriving in the aware mind in an unusual way that, like all these other facets of the phenomenon, provoke unusual questions, which of course we answer. And this is the piece we talk about it, which kind of at some point confuses the issue. So thought intrusion is a telepathic-like intrusion of a piece of information that in some ways mimics a thought. It kind of gets quite close to this in its experience, except that for me, it's much more aware. It has enough differences to bring your attention to it in a way that I don't ordinarily bring attention to my thinking, because for me thinking is automatic. It's a brain process that happens. It's not something you do in a very aware way, except to say you might slow it down when you're solving a problem and kind of say if this then that, but you're actually not changing your thinking there. You're simply changing the logic, the parameters in the thinking. So it's this telepathic-like characteristic sort of leads to beliefs in thought broadcasting, and that's the point. When people are using that label, that's an interpretation of it. And of course, the difficulty in dealing with it is the doubts about the implications of it, because our thinking or stimuli are actually predictive. If this, then that. So if this, or if my thoughts are being broadcast, then what is sort of what happens. That's the predictive nature of this. So thought intrusion, as I say, can be the most easily confused, let's put it that way. But I say the thing to notice is that it's this intrusion in the aware mind that provokes what the belief questions in exactly the same way as the others do. Now, the same can be said for some body sensations and visual sensations. So body sensations, there can be very many. Temperature, pressure, for example, are pretty sort of common. So I've had voices come up with little stories about little pinpricks in all my joints, measuring me up for something. Lots of people will complain about voices messing with their fiddly bits. For example, for some reason, our genitals seem to fascinate them sometimes. I've had some of those experiences as well. So these are just little sort of pressure points, temperature points, pricks, sort of touch sensations, if you like, on different sort of parts of the body. And so for me, my voices kind of use them two ways. One is sort of punctuation marks to add emphasis. And number two, they use them as punishment. They use them to kind of say, actually, we can just bleep with you. We can do whatever the bleep we want to with you, basically, is how they use it. Another one I'm putting in here as a somatic thing is actually our sense of time. Because we experience time in a sequential way, and it's kind of our activity. We get up in the morning, so sunrise to sunset, we have a pattern. Our rhythm, is an a circadian thing, rather. And I find that actually voices can distort that sense of time at two ends of the spectrum. The one is they can create a sense of urgency by changing the tempo. So for me, my voices will often come with a background body language of a thrum, which has a pace to it. And I notice that pace, if I notice that pace is different than my natural pace, and once I focused on it, I used my heartbeat as the sense of natural pace. And I noticed that it's actually different than my heartbeat. And when I notice that, the point is I notice it, I'm aware of it, but the effect of it is it creates this kind of sense of urgency. So it ups my tempo. I become a bit more hypervigilant. I start to anticipate stuff, even if I don't know what it is. I become a little bit more hyper, a little bit busier, more hyper, as I say, more hyper vigilant, more hyper aware. The flip side of that would be what I would call sort of, experiences that mimic an out of body experience. And for me, what's different about this is that this is actually rooted in the body and our relationship to the environment, because that's how we experience time. This is the opposite. So this is actually creating a scenario in which I become completely unaware of my physical contact to the world. So for me, the most common time for this to happen is when I'm lying in bed before I'm going to sleep and voices are just bothering me. It's a bit like I used to do with meditating. When I was meditating, I would focus, lie on the bed or the couch or the floor or whatever, and I would focus on the pressure points I could feel, and then I would focus on making myself unaware of them and bring my focus to my mind, becoming unaware of my body. And that is actually pretty much a sensation that sort of voices can create. And it's a little different in the sense I was focusing in meditating, focusing on becoming unaware of. What's happening, I find, with voices is their busyness is creating enough distraction that actually I lose contact with my body in that sort of sense. And for me, it's usually something sort of gradual. This increased sort of tempo and busyness with voices gathers my focus, and for me, is literally sort of pulls my attention that way to the point where I am no longer aware of my body, sort of lying in bed. And then voices are somehow able to create these other strange sensations of movement, of sway. So where you kind of experiencing your mind, but not your body, almost as sort of separate entities, which of course they aren't. Um, um, but it creates this lack of awareness of the body, and for me, it actually collapses. When somehow this phenomenon actually suddenly reintroduces your body, and you feel like you plopped back into bed, and you wake, you sort of sit up with a sort of start. It's not actually a question of waking. For me, this happens when I'm awake, but before I go to sleep is my most common timing for that. So that's a physical sensation, but it has these sort of time implications. So this kind of helps you either makes you more aware of time as a sense of urgency. It makes you less aware of time because you actually afterwards you kind of think, well, was that 5 minutes or was it 25 minutes? You just don't have that sense of time anymore. The other would be visual representation. So for me, there are some people who have visions detailed enough that they'll see somebody sitting in the room and they'll talk to them. For me, I haven't had things quite that detailed as far as I know. I've certainly had, been lying again. For me, typically, my voice is put on displays of phenomenology when I go to bed as a way to keep me awake and annoy me. So I've seen, photographs or sort of tiles of pictures and photographs, sort of, a screen of them sort of moving, for example. I've had little, for me, much less detailed. Actually, these tend to be sort of black and white, grainy pictures with people moving, but not talking. So they're using sign language, typically trying to sort of talk to me. These are just little scenarios that this phenomenon is creating and sort of presenting in different ways. It can get very weird. One of the weirdest I had and most irritating was, again, voices, this phenomenon disturbing my sleep and introducing this bright light in the corner of my eye. It was like going to an optician, say, and having them examine, say, your retina with this bright light shining sort of around the sort of corner of your eye. So I'm lying in bed with my eyes closed, voices chirping, and using, as I say, this visual distortion as a punishment. Literally, you're not going to go to sleep now, and introducing this bright light, as I say, into the corner of my eye, and literally, moving it around from here to here with commentary. It's just irritating stuff. But of course, what it does, this comes with story. This for me was easily dismissed. It was irrelevant. It might sort of confuse you, about the reliability of your senses. And certainly, it's led me to ask the question sometimes. There have been a few things that I've seen on my PC screen, for example, that make no sense. And I will actually, for me, there's only one or two things that can be happening. Number one is somebody's hacking into my PC at the same time that voices are bothering me. It seems unlikely, although presumably not entirely impossible, but very unlikely. The second is, knowing that, there are people who experience visions so detailed that they'll see someone sitting in a room and will actually talk to them for hours on end. I can only imagine that I'm actually seeing something on my PC screen. So it's what I call a partial vision. So in this rectangle that is my screen, I'm seeing something that I can only imagine is not there, because if it is there, somebody's messing with my technology. Okay. And of course, that seems less reasonable. Although when voices are engaging you in conspiracy ideas, of course, they try and make that more plausible. So that's then, I say, so we've done auditory, verbal, thought intrusion, I say, which can often be confusing. Some somatic and time somatic, I tend to put those two together, and some visual distortions. So all of these distort your perception in some way. They're introducing information in a way that's weird and in a way that is not related to your ordinary sensory intake, okay, which is usually either our five senses, whereas something we actually know, if it's our five senses, we know what it is from an environment. It has an origin. If it's from the mind, so the thought intrusions can very much confuse whether something's coming from the mind or somewhere else. And of course, then I said the verbal stuff. I mean, we experience voices as people, as coming from people, so we very clearly interpret that as external. That's just pretty obvious. So given all that, those multiple modes, if you like, by which this phenomenon is inserting information that shapes my perception, voices sometimes get very deliberate about the perception that they're trying to create. And of course, I'm going to give you two scenarios here very quickly. And one is for me just a display of phenomenology. This is one of the things that, to say, voices have imposed on me, for an hour or two while I'm, when I've gone to bed and I'm trying to go to sleep. That's what I call these just displays of phenomenology designed to irritate me. So in this case, one of the themes, if you like, that voices introduced was that they were just fairies, and I say just fairies from the point of view that they were kind of trying to describe themselves as just mischievous, when in fact they're downright freaking vile, which keep saying is an anagram of evil. And what they were doing here is to say, I have three voices that describe themselves as having front row seats on my life. One of them is a real pain in the ass, to put it mildly, just getting in the way and being downright malign. Would come along and say, gosh, you're not going to sleep now, Greggy boy. We're mischievous fairies. We're going to put on a show for you. And of course, I tend to hear pretty clearly the three voices saying their little bits and pieces in a very, very intrusive way, very close, very nearby, very bleep you, Greggy boy. Sinister tone and language and body language, really vile stuff. With a background of a swarm of voices, this buzz, they'll say, for me, equates to sticking your head in a swarm of bees. And then added to that a somatic sensation of pressure on the scalp. So for me, a bit like wearing, I'd bought a new bathing cap because I didn't want to get my hair wet when I went swimming. For example, I don't care about that. But anyway, putting on a plastic cap that fits the head sort of tightly. That kind of somatic sensation, along with these sounds sort of around your head and in the ear. And then with this third layer of these three voices just giving me crap, basically, about stopping me from going to sleep. Of course, by this stage, I'd learned that actually, I'd learned not to bother with the bleep questions, and I would just lie there and say, get on with it. Just let me know when you're stopped so I can go to sleep. Of course, because that's when I'm actually not fighting. Of course, this has many, many, many variations. So you've seen in my sort of mapping experience, these voices, these three in particular, change character, change personalities. In fact, they have a platform of personality or characteristics that are sort of constant. But what they do is they just play other characters. So of course, when they introduced religion, one of them was God. Actually, it was and of course, they then claimed that I was the second coming. And of course, as much as I dismissed that and then later on played up to it, all that's happening is, no matter what I believe, these voices are insisting that I'm the second coming. So, and of course, what that's doing is imposing the experience of being the second coming to this miserable character called God, who's not pleasant at all. In fact, he's downright freaking malign. Of course, he has this buddy called the devil, which of course is So contrary to the idea of a loving God, that I mean, I can't understand why anybody accepts this as, you know, as accepts these as a pairing that actually makes any kind of sense. So of course, because I can't accept that, I pushed back on this, and of course I had far better ideas than this guy anyway, and I'll show you those in some other stories. This one, of course, is just kind of saying, I'm going to make your life hell, and of course sets about actually doing so, because as you can see, they can be incredibly intrusive, they can get in the way, and of course they kind of, you know, sort of tell you about all the things that are sort of going to happen to you. And of course, as I pushed back on them, you know, they kind of just took on another character and another character and another character that I just represent with, you know, with the mask. But what's happening here is you're going to realize that this phenomenology comes together in a scenario, in a theme that sets the scene for a story of soap opera or cosmic opera. And simply by changing the characters, changing my role, whether I'm a willing partner or an unwilling partner, whether I'm the villain, the hero, the victim, you know, the phenomenology isn't an item that's independent. It's related to a story, and of course, how voices are trying to make your life downright miserable. So that's the point you need to get from details of phenomenology, which is the mode of communication, how information is inserted into the mind and engaging your processor, and then, you know, with some flamboyance added with the kind of character and displays of the story that it relates to, that voices are trying very much to impose on you. That's very clearly the experience of it. So what we have to recognize with this is that all those things combine together. You know, this Jack in the Box has these implications, as I say, you know, so by default, this phenomenon occupies the mind. It literally barges in, says, I'm here, I'm not going anywhere, I'm going to bleep with you, Greggy boy, just because I want to and because I can. It's literally what it is, which is a real pain in the ass, to put it mildly. And number two, of course, the other thing about this is it's displacing opportunity. I would much rather be doing other stuff. I would much rather be thinking about other stuff. Okay, so it occupies the mind by inserting this information in the aware mind very differently. That brings your attention to it. It's intrusive in the sense that it self-selects time and place. You know, I can't get away from it. I can't choose it. It's independent of my environment and what I'm doing. You know, through those, it asserts this level of significance, as I say, at least at the level of a relationship, which is usually abusive. And if it's God and the devil, it's really abusive. It's torture. It has no verifiability. We can't trace it. We can't check it. So, of course, you're operating in this field of uncertainty. And, of course, what the mind does in a world of uncertainty is it kind of picks a few key bits of information, tries to put four corners of a jigsaw puzzle in place, which are just beliefs. And, of course, beliefs are not truths. They're simply a way we choose based on the evidence we have in this very uncertain world to deal with this uncertainty. That's how beliefs operate in the mind. Of course, say then there's a variety of effects, you know, say these combination of these modes, plus the body language, plus timing, plus distance, clarity, blah, blah, blah. All those variety of things that hold our attention and bring our focus to what voices are saying or what they're doing. And of course, you know, that's how this stuff interferes with our perception and our concept of the world. And of course, it's competing with real world capacity. This is the displacement. Number one. Number two, it's contaminating my ordinary thinking. And of course, all of this lot combined. So significance, reaction, that's the emotional content, the volume of inputs it inserts, the competition with real world stuff, you know, it's this huge, big distraction that displaces real world opportunity and at the same time actually causes neuroplastic harm. It literally changes how our brain is programming itself. It changes our frames of reference. And our frames of reference, you know, we use to understand the world, not just voices, but the world. So it actually contaminates how we understand the world. So when I say this thing is intrusive, it's incredibly intrusive. It changes everything. So of course, what we have to do is we have to take a radical approach to obliterating it or obliterating the effects of it on the mind. So you can see why I have such a strong view on this thing when you look at it from the point of view of the impact on life and the impact on the mind and the brain and how it's programmed. The neuroplastic harm is enormous. So we really have to do something about rejecting it completely, which of course I'll show you how to do. in the recovery model. So thanks for listening to this module. Once again, I'd like to keep as much of this possible for people who hear voices. So if you can help me do that, please go to crowdrise.com, find my fundraiser, someone you know hears voices. If you've got something to say about this on social media, please use the hashtag made sense. If you'd like to work together, please contact me at greg@mad-sense.com, and please support, say, these other groups that I have mentioned before. The Hearing Voices movement and Intervoice, providing facilitated training for support groups, really worthy cause. Mad in America, changing the conversation. ISPS, getting groups of mental health professionals together to look at alternative approaches. ICHR, studying the phenomenology that we've just been talking about. Durham University, looking at our experience and the history, and many others. So please help if you can, and thanks very much.